Hey everyone, in this video we'll be taking a look at what shaped Ukraine's modern national identity and what made it different from the Russian one, despite their common origins. To explain this, we'll have to go through the history of Ukraine. Most of Ukraine is a flat, featureless extension of the vast Eurasian steppe. Because of this, Ukraine has for much of history been home to nomads that lived their lives on horseback, rather than sedentary civilizations. Before modern forms of transportation, Ukraine functioned as sort of a highway between the vast eastern steppes into Central Europe and the Balkans, a highway many nomadic tribes would utilize. As such, in Roman times, various nomadic tribes would make Ukraine their home as it was ideal for their nomadic lifestyle, and many of them, probably most famously the Huns, would also invade Rome and Europe in general through this Ukrainian highway. This had a profound impact on the Slavs who lived somewhere on the edge of this steppe and likely caused the Slavic migrations throughout Eastern and Central Europe. Groups such as the Sarmatians likely also intermingled with the Slavs and had a big impact on early Slavic language and culture before being assimilated into the broader Slavic culture, and more relevant to this video, East Slavic culture, which would eventually create a more sedentary civilization in Ukraine and Eastern Europe, despite the local geography which favored nomads. These East Slavs would be mostly unorganized and disunited up until the Viking Age, where the Norsemen, particularly the Swedes and Geats, took an interest in Eastern Slavic lands thanks to its navigable rivers, wealth, and unorganized nature, making it ideal for raiding and trading. Eventually, the Norsemen created quite an impressive trade empire around these rivers, most importantly the Dnieper, home to the largest trading post, Kiev. While the details are muddy, we know the Slavs were busy fighting both these Norsemen and the nomadic Khazars to the east, and it's thought they eventually asked the Norseman Rurik to rule Kiev and assist them. Rurik's dynasty under his relative Oleg would eventually go on to unite the Slavs under a loose federation centered around Kiev, and this loosely aligned kingdom would eventually be known as the Kievan Rus, with Rus likely being what the Slavs called the Norsemen. In short, it was a Slavic entity home to mostly Slavs, but with a Norse monarchy. This Norse monarchy very likely assimilated into the local Slavic culture eventually. This civilization, the Kievan Rus, is what would lay the groundwork for later Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian identities. But the Kievan Rus, disunited as it was, would slowly fracture into rivaling city-states over time, and just when they were at their weakest is when the Mongols invaded, and they along with their successor state in Europe, the Golden Horde, would subjugate and decimate the Kievan Rus beyond recognition. It went from a wealthy trading hub between the Baltic and Black Seas to Europe's eastern backwater. Eventually the Golden Horde would fall though, and what filled that power vacuum is what would create the divide between Ukraine and Russia. In the north and east, Moscow would rise to prominence and go on to form the Russian Tsardom. Meanwhile, modern Belarus and Ukraine to the south and west would be conquered by Lithuania, and would eventually join Poland in a personal union, creating the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth. This led to centuries of Belarus and Ukraine, or as it was commonly referred to back then, Ruthenia, being influenced by Catholicism and Western ideas much more than the territories consolidated by Moscow. On top of that, as Polish was the most prominent language in the Commonwealth, it had quite a bit of influence on Ruthenian and is thus also part of what made modern Ukrainian different from Russian, other than the natural divergence simply due to geographic distance. Another important part of what shaped the Ukrainian identity was the Cossacks. While not a major focus of this video, the origins of the Cossacks are quite interesting. In short, the Cossacks are a people that came about as a result of peasants and slaves fleeing subjugation and instead choosing to live as free people in the sparsely populated Ukrainian frontier. The Cossacks were mostly Ruthenians, but they weren't strictly made up of one linguistic or ethnic group, as many Tatars and various other nomadic peoples from this region also became Cossacks. The Cossacks essentially created their own society within the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, and one that had a lot of autonomy as well as their own army. They valued their freedom and autonomy above all else, and thus also ended up switching sides if their rulers did not respect their autonomy. They ended up doing exactly this eventually under King John Casimir II of the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, who after several revolts limited their autonomy. From then on, Cossack territory would be under Russia, where they ironically would lose even more autonomy, and this would be the first of many events that led to the partitioning of the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, and thus also Ukraine becoming a part of the Russian Empire. Under Russian rule, the Cossacks and Ukrainians as a whole were heavily oppressed, along with any other minority groups like the Tatars, as well as the once prominent Jewish population of Ukraine. They all became subject to Russification, which was essentially an attempt to make them all Russian by limiting autonomy, banning all languages apart from Russian, as well as violently putting down any revolts. This process is part of the reason why Ukraine has a large Russian-speaking minority today. The Cossack spirit lived on, however, and Ukraine never lost its identity completely. The Enlightenment, nationalism, and revolutions across Europe would in fact reinvigorate the Ukrainian identity, and during the Russian Revolution they would fight for their independence, siding with the White Army. As we all know, the Red Army ended up winning, and Ukraine would end up as a part of the Soviet Union until 1991. But this war for independence from 1917 to 1921 was still very important in shaping modern Ukraine, because it would be the first time Ukrainians saw themselves not just as a distinct people under Polish or Russian rule, but as its own nation-state. Ukraine would still face continued hardship and Russification under the Soviet Union though. One horrifying event which contributed significantly to the Russification of Ukraine was the Holodomor land reform under Stalin. It is disputed whether or not it was intentional, with some sources claiming it was an active attempt at genocide in order to suppress Ukrainian nationalism, and other sources claiming it was a combination of negligence, incompetence, and overly centralized control. Regardless of intent, the reality is somewhere between 3 and 12 million mostly ethnic Ukrainians ended up starving to death. Despite all these efforts, the Ukrainian identity endured, and when the Soviet Union dissolved and they finally got the option to vote for independence in 1991, it was a resounding yes, with only Crimea being anywhere near contested. So in summary, Ukraine's local identity arose from it having a different language and culture. This different language and culture, although still similar to Russian language and culture, was shaped by Polish and Western influence during the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, as well as the Cossacks, a unique people who valued freedom above all else. While Ukraine faced Russification for centuries, it would manage to keep its own local identity, one which would be reinvigorated and revived with their war for independence during the Russian Revolution, with all of this leading to their vote for independence in 1991. That's all for now. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you to all my channel members, and a special thank you to my second tier member, Ladahino. See you all in my next video.